Hello, welcome to the lecture about action potentials, lecture number 2. And we'll start with a reminder. So, the last lecture we talked about how there is a resting membrane potential in neural cells. If you just leave a healthy cell, a live cell to its own devices, it becomes negatively charged. And so requires negative potential relative to the space that surrounds the cell. And we discussed how it happens. So you have special thingies, special pumps that always pump potassium in the cell and sodium out of the cell, so that the concentration of potassium inside is high, but concentration of sodium inside is low, while the concentration of sodium outside remains high. Right? So you have this cell that does you have this process, this pump that moves sodium outside and moves potassium inside. But you also have special channels called leak channels that are always open, and they're they don't let too much potassium out, but they are selective for potassium. They only let potassium out, and so they act like these doors. You can imagine them as doors, and you can imagine that if you have a situation when you have like a room, this is all a reminder. If you have a room and the room is full of thingies, and this thingies like run around like kids or toddlers, then at some point one of them or another of them would escape, and so gradually they would slowly migrate kind of from this room to the outside. But if you add a process, and that happens naturally because potassium ions are positively charged, so because they're positively charged, each time a positively charged ion leaves, the voltage in the room drops a little bit, and so others become less likely to leave. It's as if with every kid that leaves the room, leaving the room would become harder, because the difference in height between this room and the room outside would change. And so at some point, even though there are many kids, relatively few of them would stumble outside. But at the same time, even though there are much fewer kids outside, falling inside the room would become much more probable, just because the room is so much lower. So they're now falling in the basement full of other kids. It's a weird metaphor, but yeah. And so because of that, naturally the cell is negatively charged. And then we talked that it's true for many cells, for almost all cells in the body. But for neurons, it's particularly important. While other cells and neurons as well use it for housekeeping reasons, they use it to transport stuff across the membrane, for example, because as it turns out, it's really handy. If there is a difference in potential and concentration across your membrane, you can use it to power machines that bring stuff in, proteins exchangers. But for neurons, it's particularly important because neurons can communicate. And the way they communicate, they break this membrane, this resting membrane potential really quickly, really transiently. They let it go, deviate from the stable value a lot, and then it quickly returns back. And so let's try to reverse engineer this process, because this process is key to neural cell functioning. So yeah, again, pumps make potassium concentration inside the cell high, sodium concentration low, and then leak channels bring the voltage inside to negative values through this process that I just described. How can we use that? How can we use this sort of default state, this starting point, in order to enable quick communication, this process of spiking, this process of generating a response or sending a message along the cell or something like that? How can we make it happen? So we want to break the potential the potential is negative, we want to perhaps make it positive real quick. So let's see. Let's try to figure out which neurons can help us in this task. We have about 4 different neurons. Oh Lord. Ions. Which ions can help us with this task? We have about 4 different ions that are key players in this process: potassium, chloride, calcium, and sodium. And some of them are positively charged, some of them are negatively charged, some of them are mostly inside the cell, some of them are mostly outside the cell. So let's take a pause and go through this list of 4 ions and think which one of those, or which ones, can help us if we allow them to act one way or another, can help us to quickly depolarize the cell, quickly increase the voltage. Which of these 4 neurons is most promising? Okay, please pause the video and think. Good, so let's do it together now. Let's start in the order in which I gave them, because, it's not a random order. So let's start with potassium. Can potassium help? Not really. And the reason for that is that potassium made the cell negatively, acquire this negative potential to begin with. So the membrane was kind of low-key permeable for potassium all along. Not the membrane itself, but the leak channels in the membrane. So potassium is actually sitting at the equilibrium. Potassium is what created the equilibrium. Potassium is what created the negative potential. It doesn't want to leave anymore. Yes, the concentration inside is still higher, but the cell is at negative potential and ions are positive and they don't want to leave. So from the concentration point of view, it wants to leave. From the voltage point of view, it wants to enter, because negative potential cell, positive ions. And so these 2 tendencies exactly counteract each other, and on average, potassium doesn't want to move. The number of ions that leave the cell at any moment will be equal to the number of ions that fall inside the cell. Okay, out of luck. What about chloride? So chloride concentration outside is higher, and from this point of view, it wants to enter. But voltage is negative, and chloride is negatively charged. So from this point of view, it wants to leave, which means that most probably chloride is not helpful to us either. It kind of probably close to the equilibrium as well. It's actually not necessarily true for every cell, but on average, chloride is probably not our biggest friend here. Because there are reasons for it to enter, but there are also reasons for it to leave. So all in all, it's kind of meh, not inclined to quickly depolarize the cell. Let's look at calcium. So calcium is actually eager to help us to depolarize the cell, because from the concentration point of view, the concentration of calcium inside the cell is pretty much 0, right? As I mentioned before, calcium is a signaling ion, and so there are special mechanisms in the cell that pretty much keep concentration of calcium at 0 as a baseline level. When calcium concentration inside the cell is not 0, it means that something is happening. It's actually used to make the cell do something. Kind of like, yeah, I put lots of intentionality in this sentence, but we'll talk about it later. It has consequences. That's what the point. But because of that, calcium is actually really eager to enter. Concentration is 0 inside, but not 0 outside, and it's positively charged. In fact, the reason it has 2 pluses is because it has a charge of 2, but it doesn't matter that much for this discussion. What matters is that it's positively charged and the cell is negative potential. So calcium normally cannot enter because the leak channels are selective for potassium and membrane is impermeable and other channels are closed. But if only we open some channels, we open some doors for calcium, it will eagerly rush into the cell, right? So that's a candidate, but that's kind of a little bit weird candidate because calcium is special. What about sodium, which is one of the most common ions, right, in this story? The blood is salty, as I mentioned. If you ever tasted blood, you know it's salty. So, yeah, how's about sodium? It turns out it also wants to enter, right? It's positively charged and it's sitting outside. So, concentration-wise, it wants to enter, and voltage-wise, it wants to enter. And sodium becomes our main candidate for depolarizing the cell quickly. So again, if only we can open the doors for sodium and let it enter the cell, we'll get a quick depolarization, a quick increase in voltage. Right? And what will happen? Actually, yeah, I kind of spoiled the answer, but how will voltage change? Or rather, like, why would voltage change? So let's think about it. Sodium really wants to enter because cell is negative and the concentration of sodium is low. And now we open a door for sodium. Imagine that. So now sodium can enter. Sodium ions start to enter. How does the potential of the cell change? Sodium ions are positively charged. They're entering, which means the potential increases. Does that make sense? Yay. So, okay. At first, cell is at negative potential. Sodium wants to enter but cannot. We open doors and sodium can enter and it depolarizes the cell. And we can depolarize the cell. This process can be used for communication. Good. So what's missing? Two things are missing. One, we need to somehow, it shouldn't be a one-time event. We should bring the cell back to the original state because we want the cell to do it again and again and again. So now the cell is depolarized. It is in a high potential. How can we bring it again to low potential? Well, for one, it would be nice to close these doors for sodium, right? And then maybe leak channels will gradually take care of it. That's true, but leak channels are slow. So maybe let's like open more channels. So what if we close the door for sodium, but we open another door for potassium? Because now the cell is at high potential and potassium, concentration of potassium inside is high and it's positively charged. So previously potassium was at equilibrium, but now it's no longer at equilibrium, right? Because the cell is depolarized. So from the concentration point of view, it still wants to leave, but now from the voltage point of view, it also wants to leave. And so if we have this process where we first open doors for sodium, but then we close them and open doors for potassium, we can make the potential of the cell go up and then go down. So we'll have to take care of that. But at least we now identified a way to bring the cell back. So another open issue is how to open these doors quickly. So these doors are probably channels, right, in the membrane. But we need to find a way to open them really quickly and close them quickly. How can we make it happen? Well, here we have a short detour into the concept of positive and negative feedback. What is positive and negative feedback? You might have heard about, you might have heard these terms before. So if you have heard them before, then pause the video and try to formulate what they are, just to kind of express your basic idea in words, because it's helpful. If you never heard, just continue listening. But if you heard these words before, try to nail it down. What is positive feedback and what is negative feedback? Maybe even take a piece of paper and write it down. Yeah, so positive feedback means that when you have something, it causes even more of this something. Right? It's not a very good definition. I checked what dictionaries say. They use some clever words, but yeah, basically the amplification of an effect by its own influence, which means that you have something and it affects the system in such a way that you have more of this something, and then even more of this something, and then even more of this something. There is an amplification effect, right? Positive feedback. And negative feedback is kind of the opposite of that. The counteraction on an effect by its own influence. So you have something which causes some consequences that decrease the amount of this something. Okay, let's look at two examples. Two examples that illustrate two different points, actually. So one example, poverty. A poor kid drops out of school because they need money. They have to go and get a job immediately, and they start a bad job and they stay this bad job and they remain poor. Is it an example of positive feedback or negative feedback? That's an example of positive feedback, right? The whatever, in this case poverty, begets more poverty. So it's like a vicious cycle. Vicious cycles and virtuous cycles, as people say, are both cases of positive feedback. When you have money, you get more money. When you are poor, if a society is not like fine-tuned in a kind way, then there are all the reasons for this person to remain poor. And that's an example of positive feedback, which means that the word positive actually is used here in a very different way than a normal person would use it, because it's clearly a negative thing in the sense that it's bad. But it's an example of positive feedback, because positive is not about the moral qualities of what's happening, but about the sign of interaction between the effect and itself. Does it increase the amount of whatever, or does it decrease the amount of whatever? Here's another example. People are starving, and so neighbors who were previously, who didn't care, now they're like, oh, poor neighbors, here's some bread for you. And they give them some bread. Is it positive feedback or negative feedback? That's an example of negative feedback, right? Because suffering makes other people compassionate, and they try to reduce this suffering, which again illustrates that that's a positive thing in a normal use of this word, but in this almost mathematical use, we call it a case of negative feedback, because the process works in such a way that it reduces the amount of something when it appears, hopefully. Here. Okay, so just to drive it home, pause the video and take a few seconds to come up with your example of positive and negative feedback before we go further. Please do. All right. One really good example of positive feedback, and I wonder if you came up with something like that, is an explosion. And that's actually really relevant for our discussion of action potentials. How do explosions work? Let's think about that. And why are they so fast and so destructive? With an explosion, you have some explosives, and at first they just lie there, right? It's a chemical that's packed in one way or another, and you have this chemical and nothing happens. But then at some point it explodes. What happens? Well, so you have this explosive stuff, you have these molecules, and these molecules are ready for a chemical reaction, and this chemical reaction releases lots of heat. And so what happens is that a few molecules somehow are tricked into breaking apart, and the reaction happens and heat is released. And then this heat or the buildup of pressure, because a release of energy causes both an increase in temperature and an increase in pressure. So either both of them or one of them causes more molecules to break, and then even more energy is released, and then even more molecules break apart, and even more energy is released, and you have this growth, this really fast engagement of more and more stuff into this deconstructive process, and that's what causes an explosion. So if this energy were released over the course of years, nobody would have noticed anything, right? But because of this positive feedback effect, the more explosion you have, the more explosion you get. It releases so fast, it develops so fast that we have this situation when the pressure builds up really quick and we have this destructive explosion. But what's important for us here is that it's a positive feedback and the process is really fast. So if we can harness this process for creating an action potential, because we're still reverse engineering an action potential, then we can make the cell depolarize, increase its potential real fast, right? So here's a picture of an action potential. The x-axis is time, and the real action potential is very fast. It's the width of this deviation and coming back is only about 1 millisecond, 1/1000th of a second. And so the x-axis is time and y-axis is potential inside the cell compared to the potential outside of the cell, electric potential, right? And it sits at this negative. Where's my drawing thinking? Oh Lord. Okay, so at first it sits at this negative value, which is the resting, but then it goes up and then it goes down, and it happens real fast. And for the growing phase, we really want to use positive feedback. So if the growing phase is like an explosion, if it's like an explosion, then if we can build this positive feedback in it, then it will be really fast. And then, unlike in an explosion, here we cannot afford the cell to fire once and never fire again. So we have to come up with another process that would somehow bring it back and reduce the potential back to its baseline value. And we may have a little bit of weirdness here. If it doesn't come exactly to this value, if it takes a little while to clean things up, that's okay. If it's still a few milliseconds, it's probably doable, because generating lots of these things may be important for some cells, but it's more important to be able to send them in principle again and again than to be super fast. So we can afford the cleanup can take a little bit longer than the build-up, but the build-up should be very fast. And the vocabulary. The official name of this thing is an action potential. So if you want to use a verb, you could use a cell generate an action potential. That's a full form, kind of bow tie version of it, but obviously it's too long for people to actually use and say all the time. So in practice, people usually say that the cell fires or that it spikes. And both words are obviously metaphors. And the cell fires is like with firearms, the cell goes like, right? So it's a fast process, and it's kind of violent in some way because it feels like an explosion, but at the same time it can be repeated. And spikes is a visual metaphor, actually. So if you plot this voltage, but you plot it not for these 8 milliseconds only, but you monitor it. So what you see is the cell the voltage goes like that and maybe changes a little bit, and then suddenly the cell goes up and down, and then it stays again, and then you have another event like that. And so each event looks kind of just like, if the scale in time is if you're monitoring the cell for seconds, then each event, each action potential will look just like a line crossing your baseline, so it looks like a spike, and that's where the word spike came from. And depolarize and hyperpolarize are also words that I have used already. Depolarize means increasing the potential, and hyperpolarize means decreasing it back. There are also other words like repolarization that I don't like. Polarization, dep, and repolarization. I prefer to use words depolarize and hyperpolarize because I think they're less ambiguous. Okay, so we now have a goal. We want to have this positive feedback happening, but how? Where can we get it? Okay, channels. The doors in the membrane that we open for ions are channels, right? We had these leak channels that like let potassium sip slowly, but can we have channels that open that are larger, and also channels that would enable this positive feedback reaction? Well, let's think. So channels may be selective for potassium or for sodium, so that's good. We'll actually use that. We'll need the channel that's selective for sodium first, and then the channel that's selective for potassium later. But what about like opening them? Can we have channels that open and close? Yeah, we can. We just make a channel so that, you know, it's not always in the same shape, but its shape can change slightly. I think the easiest channel to think of are stretch activated channels, and they're not particularly common, but we have them. You have them. And with stretch activated channels, it's typically closed, but if the membrane is bent or stretched, then the channel opens. Because it's like the parts of the channel don't hold to each other that strongly that it always stays closed, but they can kind of move a little bit further apart and open the channel. So let's have a really quick tangent and think why would we have channels like that? Where in our bodies these channels are used, may be used, and are actually used? Stretch activated channels, channels that when you bend the membrane, they let some, let's say, sodium through. Why? Think about that. Pause the video, think about that. Here's the answer, one of the answers. What kind of, let's think of the point when we have our body and then something bends and something happens, like channels, so maybe they're in neurons, right? Sodium, so maybe the neuron spikes as a result, right? So something bends, neuron spike. When is it helpful? Touch. Touch is a good example, right? Because how does touch work? We have skin, and when the skin bends, we feel it somehow. So there has to be a cell inside that when the skin bends, sends some information somewhere to the brain, right? And indeed, there are special neurons that have just their processes. They, again, outgrowth is thin thingies growing out of them, stretch through your skin, and they're full of these stretch activated channels. So when you touch your skin, you bend it, and you bend these fibers, these neurons, that parts of these neurons that lie inside. And because they're full of stretch activated channels, these channels open, sodium enters the cell depolarizes and generates an action potential, sends it to your brain, talks to your brain, and now you feel that like you actually touched something. So that's helpful. But back to our action potential generating thing. We want a process that would be self-perpetuating. So sodium enters, cell depolarizes, somehow it should trigger even more sodium entrance. What can open this channel? Sodium, maybe. That's actually hard as it turns out, but what's easy is, relatively easy, is voltage activated channels. These are channels that are open or closed depending on the potential across the membrane. And if you imagine a channel like that that's closed when the cell is at negative potential, but that becomes open when the cells arrives at a slightly more positive potential, then you have enough to build an explosion-like positive feedback process, right? Because the cells, these channels aren't closed, then we just need somehow to start the process. Some sodium enters, cell depolarizes. Channels are now voltage activated, voltage sensitive, voltage gated is another official term for that. So they open, sodium enters, depolarizes the cell even more channels open, even more sodium enters, and we have this process that is quite like an explosion. All right? So yeah, which means that this rising phase of the action potential may be achieved if you just put lots of voltage gated sodium channels in there. Sodium enters, channels open, more sodium enters, more channels open, more sodium enters, it depolarizes the cell, more channels open, right? And if we need to somehow clean it up, we can actually use a different type of voltage gated channel. Just these channels should be selective for potassium, not for sodium. So the big discovery that happened back in the, was it 50s, 40s or 50s, when the mechanisms of the voltage of the action potential were discovered, is that even though if you record the potential, it looks like it goes up and it goes down, it looks like one thing, actually there are two things involved: sodium and potassium. And sodium is responsible for the rising part, for the first half, for the potential going up. And then potassium is responsible for the voltage going down. So if you use some special equipment and some special tricks to record these two currents separately, to record separately the sodium current and separately the potassium current, you will see that indeed first you have only sodium and no potassium, and then later you have only potassium and no sodium. So they kind of change roles. All right? So I always wanted to come up with a good metaphor for that, because for the first half, for the sodium entering, for the positive feedback loop, we have this explosion thing, or forest fire. Forest fire is another example, especially, you know, if the forest is really dry, as they are these days sometimes, because thanks climate change. Then when you have fire, it causes more fire, and so you have this buildup of fire. And it's also a good metaphor because forest fires can propagate, just as action potentials can propagate, as we will talk in a few minutes. But the thing with forest fires is that the process of recovery, while it happens, it's much slower, right? It takes a few years, probably a few decades, for the undergrowth, in case of a undergrowth fire, for the undergrowth to grow again and to enable the next fire. While in the action potential, the process of inactivation, kind of returning back to the original voltage, is about as fast as the process of depolarization. So the best example that I came up is like this weird vignette where you have a bunch of little emotional kids and some really strict teachers. So imagine some sort of, you know, orphanage in a steampunk universe, which is kind of grim dark a little bit. And so you have these kids and they are on a walk with teachers, and the teachers are really nasty. And kids, one of the kids sees an ice cream truck or an ice cream selling point, and the kid starts to scream like, "Oh, ice cream!" It wasn't supposed to be a pun. It just, but whatever kids like. What do kids like? Sweets. Maybe like sweets. And then other kids, because they're really, really hungry, because it's a steampunk orphanage, they're like, where are the sweets? What do we have? Bagels? What do kids like? Donuts? Really? Are there donuts? And so the more kids are involved in this screaming donuts, the more other kids hear that, and the more they scream. So it's like the crowd goes wild. But then the teachers are really strict. But they are old and so a little bit slow. So at first they don't react, but then at some point they take out their rulers and they start beating kids and saying, shush, behave, silence, you will have no donuts in our orphanage. And they kind of, make the whole screaming process disappear. But nothing prevents this process from repeating again. So sodium channels are like these kids. The more sodium gets in, the more doors open, the more channels open, because of the voltage increases, the more sodium gets in. But then at some point, potassium kicks in and kind of reverses the process. Unfortunately, this year, we have an even better metaphor, a little bit weirder, but, more realistic, unfortunately. And that's pandemic waves. Because if you see what happens in the last several months, it's basically the same process in all countries. So people start to die, and then everybody freak out. And they stop going out, they stop going to the store, they start wearing masks. Everything gets better. And then everything stays better for a few weeks, and people are like, okay, it's over. And they start going to bars again, and they, start socializing, and the cases go up again. And in some states in the United States, and I think in some countries, people already had 2 waves like that. So not just one wave, but it really went up and down, up and down. So it looks like as a society, we're quite capable of supporting these waves, where we're like, relax, and then everything is horrible. And then we're like, oops, and then it goes down. And then we're like, it's over, and everything is horrible again. Yeah, so it's like giant action potentials generated. Except in this case, it's more like, in both cases, it's the behavior of people that's in charge of that. So it's not exactly 2 different entities, like in case of sodium and potassium. But, if you exploit the metaphor, if you modify it a little bit, you can see the parallels, I guess. Okay. All right. So good channels, voltage gated channels. What are channels made of? So let's get to the it's all theoretical talk. We're reverse engineering action potential. We pretty much know what we want. We can kind of reverse engineered it, and yeah, they exist. We know that they exist. But how is it possible that voltage gated channels exist? What are they made of? What channels are made of? What do you think? What's their nature? They're not metal, right? They're not plastic. What are they made of? Make a bet. What are channels made of? Channels are kind of like machines, right? What are machines in the cell made of? All the machinery. Almost all the machinery are proteins. There is only one machine that's not a protein, that's involved in synthesis of proteins, that's RNA based. All other machines, the vast majority, almost all the machines in the cell are proteins. Everything that brings something somewhere, that combines something, that supports something, that makes something move, all of that is proteins. All the chemical reactions as well, right? Enzymes. So channels are proteins. They're huge proteins, and here we have on the left is a model of I think it's probably potassium. Yeah, it's potassium, voltage-gated potassium channel. That's actually what I downloaded because it says so here. So it's voltage-gated potassium channel. And the membrane, I think it's over about here. So this part sits in the membranes. This part sticks out of the membrane. And you can see it's symmetric. Why is it symmetric? So here we're looking from the side. If we look from the top or from the bottom, probably from the top, we get this picture. It has to have a pore. In order to work like a channel, it has to have a hole through which potassiums can go. And yeah, so that's why it looks like, it has this symmetry. And indeed, there was a hole in the middle, and they even here they showed a potassium ion. So a potassium channel looks like that. And because it's a voltage-gated channel, it has to be able to move just a little bit, so that this pore, it doesn't have to move a lot, but this pore has to become a little bit smaller or a little bit larger. And then when it's smaller, potassium won't be able to go through, and when it's slightly larger, potassium will be able to go through. Right? And these are pictures of a different channel, because, you know, this one, the potassium one, had 4 kind of parts to it. See the symmetry here is like, it looks kind of vaguely like a cross. These channels consist of 6 subunits, but the cool thing about that is that people actually use the really fancy microscope to actually look at different channels and catch different channels at open and closed state. And so each channel is like tiny and it moves, so everything is really noisy. But then they looked into the average, these shapes, and they were able to see how closed channels here are different from open channels here. It's a different kind of channel, but it gives you the idea. Channels can be really open and closed because these parts that make the channel move slightly relative to each other and change the size of the pore. And so this is the summary for this first part, first half of the lecture. Basically, so time here, this part, time goes like that. So that's time. That's time. And at first everything's closed. And let's look at sodium channels first. So basically there are 3 points to it. We have, the first point is that we have voltage-gated sodium channels and voltage-gated potassium channels. The second point is that voltage-gated sodium channels are fast. So once the cell starts to depolarize, they immediately open and let more sodium in that depolarizes the cell and creating a positive feedback. But they also have this special thing that closes them later called inactivation. And while this picture shows these schematics, so they kind of look more like plastic toys than molecules, but it shows 2 important parts. So one, in order to make a channel voltage gated, you have to have a part of the channel charged, right? That's how you make it sensitive to the voltage. So as the potential across the membrane changes, this charged part of the channel wants to go through the membrane, but it can't because it's part of a channel. So what happens is that it just moves a little bit. If you have a positive thingy, it will move towards the cell when the cell is negative, and it will move away from the cell when the cell is positive, for example, right? And so the channel itself has to have this charged part to it so that it could try to move up and down, thus closing and opening the channel. But in case of so this is one part, but in case of a sodium channel, it also has a different part, and this part closes and opens, can close and open inactivating the channel. So the way it works, it's like you have a channel and then you have a cell, and this is the inside of a cell, and the channel has a little part that is positively charged. So when the cell is negatively charged, this part stays away from the pore, but if the cell becomes positively charged, then this part tries to escape, but it cannot because it's connected to the channel, and so it just gets into the pore and clogs it. And that's what actually happens with sodium channels. So sodium channels are closed at first, then they open, but then in a while they kind of and they inactivate because they plug themselves with this part. And potassium channels don't have this inactivation mechanism. Well, actually some of them do, but these canonical ones don't. So they just open, but they are kind of deliberately created, designed, and I use the words created and designed in a really weird way. So evolution selected them. So they, if you look at them, they look as if they were engineered to work like that, but they have this shape because they work, because channels like that like contributed to the, because channels like that are useful. Well, yeah, we need to talk more about that, about evolution. We will. So, but these channels have something to them that makes them a little bit sluggish. So while they start opening kind of together with sodium channels, it takes them a while to open. So, and the way it's actually kind of done is that sodium channels come in one piece, but potassium channels come in several pieces, and it takes a while before all of these pieces move. And once these pieces, all of them move, only then the channel opens. And the result is that they open with a delay. And by that time, the cell is already depolarized, but then now they open, potassium starts to leave, sodium channels shut down, and cell returns back to its original state. Okay? Yep. So now we have a bunch of examples and a bunch of consequences and a bunch of tangents, but I will probably stop this lecture right now and start a new one so that we have two different videos. So see you in part 2.